Sydney Pollack, welcome. There were about 250 people in this Art Deco cinema near the centre of Sydney an hour ago. There are about 80 very loyal cinema goers who've seen The Interpreter and stayed to talk to you. So,
Great.
welcome again to Australia. Look, we know that Alfred Hitchcock tried to film a scene from North by Northwest in the United Nations, and they wouldn't let him. So how is it that you were able to succeed where Hitchcock failed?
Well, I wish I could tell you it was because of my looks or talent or something, but it really was, I think, more a question of timing. I'm sure if Mr. Hitchcock were alive today, he would have been allowed to film there. I just didn't take no for an answer, and I kept on going back until I finally went all the way up to Kofi Annan and was able to spend a half hour with him.
Yeah.
And I don't really know what I said exactly, other than the fact that I was convinced that I wouldn't embarrass him, and that it was important to me to present the UN as authentically as possible. And it was a conversation kind of like that. And he said, "Well, let me rethink this. We've never done it before. How much time would you need?" And I sort of said, "Well, I'll take whatever you give me. If you give me a day, I'll take that. If you give me 2 days, I'll take that," and so on. And about 2 weeks later, he had someone call me and say, "Okay, we'll let you in." And I was really ecstatic, because I don't think I could have made the film without the use of the UN.
It's, I forgot to introduce myself, by the way. It's Julie Rigg speaking to you. I'm the Radio National film person, and we did actually have a chat when you were down here a few years ago.
Yes, I was on the show. I remember when I was there last.
Yeah. While we've been waiting, there's one of the members of the audience is a UN employee, not a mission employee, but a field employee. She places like Rwanda. And she's just told a rather outrageous story about some of the diplomacy you reputedly exercised to get to film in the UN, that the Australian ambassador was involved, that 12 heads of mission went to lunch and to order cocktails, and Nicole came and charmed them.
Well, they did have a diplomatic dinner for all of us, and I don't think I've ever seen so many ambassadors turn out even for a UN meeting, because they knew Nicole would be there, and I accompanied her to that, and it was they were just like regular movie fans. They were all lined up, wanted their pictures taken with her, wanted her autograph, and so on. She really did charm them.
Yeah. You said the United Nations asked for that the UN be presented as authentically as possible. Did anyone at any stage want to see a script?
Yes, of course. What they said was they didn't call it precisely script approval, but they did say that they reserved the right, and indeed they did, to make us take out any footage at all if they found anything that they thought was embarrassing to the UN or truly detrimental to the UN, or anything that they felt was misrepresenting in a egregious way the UN. So I was a little bit on pins and needles, because I didn't have a script when I started. I had just an idea and got caught by time, and we started working, and as I was shooting, I was giving them pages. They were reading the pages, and okay so far, okay so far, okay so far. And as a matter of fact, as I speak to you now, Kofi Annan hasn't seen the picture. I think he's going to see it tomorrow. But last week, a week or so ago, Shashi Tharoor, who's his undersecretary,
He's the novelist and
That's right.
has written
That's
about Bollywood, among other things. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And he was a big ally and was quite for us doing it. And he was our liaison. And he's seen the picture and is quite thrilled with it, and told the Secretary General. So I'm not worried that they're going to try to make us cancel the film now. But I was worried for a while.
But did anyone at any stage ask you to change anything?
No, they pointed out accuracies and inaccuracies to us. We ran into some bureaucratic stuff having to do with the International Criminal Court and precisely how that would be handled. We ran into some research areas where they were extremely helpful to us in terms of what an interpreter could and could not do in terms of participating in various language translations, because they only can translate in one direction, and that is their mother tongue. So I had made many casting mistakes by having people with accents, because I wanted the sense of internationalism, where in fact, if you're speaking English, you would never have an accent, because you can only interpret into English if English is your mother tongue. You can only interpret into French if French is your mother tongue. So in fact, I could never have an interpreter speaking English who sounded like she was French or African, you know.
Yeah. I'm going to open it to the audience in just a minute, but before we cross, I mean, The Interpreter is a thriller, and both the politics of this fictional African country and the UN are a kind of, thematic background for the film, rather than it being a didactic film about international diplomacy.
Well said.
But I just wondered what you thought about the United Nations these days. It's an institution that has taken a bit of a battering. Your own country is interested in discrediting it from time to time.
Well, yes, of course, and I worry about that, because we don't. Aside from the fact that no one can say that the United Nations has been 100% effective on a practical level in carrying out what its very noble intentions were. But on the other hand, we don't have a replacement for it, and I don't know what the other choices are. So I get very worried when I hear it. I don't mind it being criticized. What I hate to hear is that we should do away with it, because that would mean that we have no alternative to violence. 2,000 years of this, and we're no better off than we were, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. That would be really sad. I'm afraid it's partially true, but it would be awfully sad. So I certainly hope that they'll be able to improve, fix, add to, re-examine, restructure, if you will, the United Nations so that it can function on a practical level more effectively than it has been. But the idea of abandoning it completely and discarding it is very, very sad to me.
Okay, I'm going to open it now to the floor. Who's got a question? Yep.
Oh, hello, Sydney. My name is Tim. I've admired your work for years and years, and a particular favourite of mine is The Electric Horseman. One question I'd like to ask you, it's slightly off the track of The Interpreter. I've always admired your the effectiveness of the dialogue that you put in your films. Would you just be able to share one or two of your secrets as to how you get your dialogue so good?
Well, first of all, thanks, Tim. I appreciate the kind words. I just care a lot about dialogue, and am very careful with the writers that I work with, and spend an awful lot of time. Really, the only way I could say it, and I don't mean to be grandiose at all, but I think of it as sculpting the words. That is, sometimes I'll sit and work for weeks and weeks on a page of dialogue, adding a comma, taking a comma out, inverting a word here, adding a word, taking another word away. And then when we start, I try to get good enough actors so that they don't make you aware that this is all written, but basically trying to make you forget that anybody worked very hard on it, because always the trick is not to let the effort show. But I do spend a lot of time and care on the dialogue, because it's the main instrument of communication. I mean, it's one of the reasons I worry terribly about it being dubbed and subtitled, because you lose an awful lot of that. Obviously, you're hoping that the movie will work without it, because most of the world isn't going to see it in English. But I do work very hard on it, and I've lucked out with really great writers. The writers that I've had, particularly on this film, Steve Zalian, Scott Frank, and my old favorite, David Rayfield, who I've worked with for some almost 40 years now. And mostly I work with David on dialogue. He's not a structuralist. I get the structure from the other writers. But then I do a lot of dialogue work with Rayfield, where the two of us will sit in a room together and just go over and over it a word at a time. Thanks for the question and the comments, Tim.
Do the actors have a say in this, or do you get on into rehearsal stage, or even on the
actor? Well, I always want to listen to the actors, of course, but I'm not. I'm afraid to say I'm not a big rehearser. I don't rehearse very much. For me personally, the rehearsal process is a holdover from theater, and it's really designed for a time when the director isn't there, when the curtain goes up. And I find the whole filmmaking process to be a different one, even though when we first started film, it was a form of stage and we used all the rules of the stage. It's a completely different medium for me now, and I get my excitement out of making films by the difference between film and theater. And one of the major differences is finding the movie at the moment you're making it. That is, I want to have this sense so much that it's happening for the first time, that it isn't rehearsed. So I don't do a lot of rehearsal, but I do spend a lot of time with the actors before I start shooting a film. And I will rehearse just enough to get them comfortable with movement, but almost always roll the camera way too early rather than later, because often I've missed beautiful, completely impulsive, real moments by having them blast out in rehearsal and not being able to get them back again.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. You, looking way back in your career, when you first started out making television, drama was live. In some cases.
Well, I didn't direct any live television. I only acted in it, but you're absolutely right. It was live.
Yeah. Yeah, and yet it was, still stuck in those theatre conventions. We have another question over here.
Hello, Mr. Pollack. My name's George. Another big fan of yours. Two brief questions. Firstly, do you think this film will get a release in Zimbabwe? Which is my kind of way of asking whether you got any pressure beforehand from behind the scenes and even during the making of it, when people realised they could see through the subject matter about the politics of it. And secondly, the final shot with Sean Penn sitting on the railing, you pan over the New York skyline, which the whole film is beautifully shot. But I was wondering if the point you were trying to make was that the two towers were missing from that skyline, and whether that was a subtle little final image you wanted to finish on.
Well, as to the first question, George, I got no pressure at all about fictionalizing it. I made the choice myself to fictionalize it because in some ways you can be truer with fiction in this case than you can with being authentic, only in the sense that I would be restricted to absolute truth, and that would make it very hard for it to be for me to be in any way free dramatically to say what I want to say or have the man walk the way I want him to walk or do what I wanted him to do. If he was a real character and it was a real country, I would have some tougher restrictions on me. And so I just didn't feel that was the way to go. Secondly, the closing image, I wanted it to be as well, let's say, poetic and a reminder as possible of the fact that the buildings are missing, but the building that's still there is the UN. Effective or not effective, it's still there, and it still has hopes. I mean, one of the things that's so wonderful about that place, and this have nothing to do with literal politics, it just had to do with why I wanted to shoot in there, is that it's like being an atheist and walking into a terrific cathedral somewhere in Rome or something. You can understand religion, even if you're not religious yourself, because something bleeds out of the building onto you. And that's very true when you walk into the General Assembly Hall at the United Nations. You feel very strongly the nobility of the hope of it when it was first started. Never mind that on a practical level, at a cynical time in the world, it's had a lot of difficulty. What you realize is how high the hopes were, and there's something in the physical aspect of the building that has that. So I really wanted to end on two notes. One was that it was still there, and the other is that the Twin Towers weren't any longer, and that if the only way we have of settling arguments is destruction, that would be a very, very sad state of affairs. The first instrument of diplomacy we have are words. And as long as people can take them seriously and use them well, they should and ought to be some form of at least attempted reconciliation in the case of perceived injustice, rather than saying the only way we can settle this is with a bomb or bullets or a plane to crash into something.
So if the UN is a cathedral, it takes an act of faith sometime to continue
That's right.
the discourse. We have another question over here.
Yes, Mr. Pollack, thank you. Yen speaking from Screen Hub. This question, I suppose, is slightly about the issue of making films. And when I did a bit of research before coming here, I was just gobsmacked at the amount of films that you've made, and hats off to you for that. It took over 8 pages, so I put it down into 9-point type and printed it out. One question that I suppose is bearing on the minds of Australian filmmakers now is, and we saw it very recently with a film which people will guess, but I won't name it here. And obviously they appointed a star, and the film flopped. They brought in their local Australian star, and it certainly created buzz and hype and word of mouth, and the film fell flat on its face. And it wasn't a bad film, by my reckoning. Obviously, you've played the system, you know the system. Stars play a very important part in a big budget picture such as this. My question is, you've produced, you've directed, you've acted. You've obviously got some judgment on this. Where do you draw the line between putting the star first and the film first?
Well, I'm going to say something now that you'll probably find hard to believe, but you have to trust me on this. I'm too old to lie. I've never directed a film in which I thought I could have used better actors rather than stars. I don't know anybody that would be better than Sean Penn in Sean Penn's role here, and I don't know anybody that would be better than Nicole Kidman. I don't know anybody that would be better in Out of Africa than Meryl Streep. I don't know anybody that would be better in The Way We Were than Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford. I don't know anybody that would be better in Tootsie than Dustin Hoffman and Jessica Lange, and so on. I've never made a film where I felt I was being forced to use stars for the sake of stars, and therefore sacrificed the level of skill or talent of another actor. I truly haven't felt that. It's absolutely true that I work in a system, at least when I direct, not so much when I produce, because there I make a lot of independent films and raise independent financing and work with lesser-known actors. But in each case, I'm trying to find the best actor for the role, and I always start with that. I don't think I would come up to the plate with a star that I thought was really a lousy actor for the role. I had a bit of a I didn't have a fight with the studio, but we had a lot of discussion here about who was going to play opposite Nicole Kidman. And there were a lot of stars suggested to me that I didn't think were right for this part. And when I first suggested Sean Penn, they were quite surprised at that, not because they don't admire Sean Penn, but because they don't think of him as a romantic leading man in a mainstream movie. I had to do an enormous amount of convincing to them that this was the guy that could shake up Nicole in a way that would, where they could disturb each other in a way that I thought was necessary here. It's a short film, it's 5 days, it's 5 scenes with the two people, and they have to make a lasting impression on one another. So I always start with who's the best person for the job. When this picture first came to me, there was a lot of talk about Julia Roberts. I'm a huge Julia Roberts fan, huge. But I would not have believed her in this role. I wanted Nicole because I believe that Nicole has this kind of international sense, that she has an exoticness that's required here. I believe the intensity of her as somebody who could potentially be dangerous. I believe the vulnerability in her. I believe her language ability, all of those. I believe she could hold 2 passports, all of that. So I always start with that. Now, they happen to be movie stars, but in each case, I honestly can tell you that I wouldn't rather have anyone other than the people I've worked with.
We have another question. Thank you.
Hello, Sydney. My name's Sean. I'm a big fan. Obviously, I just wanted to make a couple of comments and ask you generally, broadly, about the theme of this film, and also relate it back to some of your others. When I was younger, I was a big fan. I remember watching The Way We Were and thought that was a fantastic film, especially I thought it was wonderfully honest sort of story, and it's one of the things I admire about Robert Redford, and I think Sean Penn has that quality as the leading male in this story. And the thing I was wondering about this film is the theme of interpretation. I thought that what was interesting is that Sean Penn is also an interpreter, but he's obviously he's more interested in lies and what's the truth. You can see both characters as versions of the same idea. And I also noticed the sort of idea of the recurring dialogue about being gone or being dead, and having different meanings but also the same meaning. Can you just talk generally about the theme of the film and how it relates to the relationship between the characters?
Well, I sort of, as I said, when I was talking about finding the film, I also find the themes of the film. What happened was I started by reading a screenplay that was fascinating in terms of its writing and was very well written by Charles Randolph, but told a story that I didn't particularly want to tell, with characters that didn't completely interest me that much. But it was a world that I loved, with a lot of good writing in it, a lot of which I kept. And I started from there and began, obviously it's called The Interpreter, so the first thing I began to think about was interpretation as a process, the preoccupation with words. One of the most impressive plays, modern plays that I'd seen, and one I remembered for a long time, was Tom Stoppard's play The Real Thing, in which the leading character is a playwright who at one point gets very, very angry with the young girl that he lives with who seems at the moment to be enamored of another younger playwright who this playwright feels butchers words. And he does a 2-page monologue, which was a showstopper, about words and about if they're cared for properly, how much they can accomplish. And I've always remembered that section, and I typed it out and actually spent a lot of time with each of my writers talking about it, and basically saying, we have a movie here which is basically about diplomacy versus violence, and the instrument of diplomacy itself being words, and the question whether or not, speaking of the United Nations, words ultimately can carry the weight or the strength they have to when they're pitched against bullets or weapons. Is this even a feasible argument? And so I got into that. I have a woman whose life was steeped in violence, who decided to give it up and try her hand at something else that she believed in momentarily, and then loses her faith in that when violence hits so close to home again. I have a man who's been exposed all his life to crime. He's a cop. He believes that, like a lot of people believe, animals don't have words. There's no reason for words except to lie, to be deceitful with. All criminals use words to lie. The film's got lie detector tests in it. It's got polygraphs in it. People strap things on to see if they're telling the truth or not. So in some way, it became about that, but then it also became, to me, about being able to move on from violence, or let's say get over grief, if you will. So it became about healing in some way, and that's where I got fascinated with this whole idea of naming the names of the dead and being able to move on. Because it became then this question of the parable that she tells Sean Penn about the drowning man in the coup place, where here's a chance to take revenge. You've had an unjust act committed to you, and you have a choice now. Your choice is, I want revenge. I want the eye I want to get back the eye for the eye and the tooth for the tooth. And the problem, of course, is that's a chain that won't ever end. It'll go on and on and on and on and on. And what this tribe believes, this fictional tribe, or so we said and concocted in the picture, is, you'll have revenge, but you'll have grief for the rest of your life, and that the only way you can get past the grief is to move on from this in some way. So all of those things were a preoccupation, but to be honest with you, I can sound very pretentious saying all that. My job, honestly, is to try to entertain you, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I can't help think about these other more serious things because they're the underpinnings for me. But I'm hoping all of that doesn't get boring and obvious. I'm hoping what happens is that the thriller aspects of the picture and the relationship between Sean and Nicole interest you, and then maybe over a cup of coffee you might talk about these other things. But I always have to bury them a little bit. I think about them a lot, but then I think Tootsie's a very serious movie. I made Tootsie about sexual politics in a very serious way, but I never for a moment did realize that I was supposed to be making you laugh.
Yeah. Can we take one last very quick question? And it's the lady who has worked for the UN in all kinds of places, including Rwanda.
Yeah, I love the film, Sydney. Just a quick question. I did work in New York and in Africa with the UN. There's a point in the... It's interesting that two Australians set up the UN. That was Everett and Jesse Street, who formulated in the ashes of 1944-45 the journey of the UN. But in the film, you talk...
Can you hang on 1 second? There's somebody back at the door. Come in. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
You have Nicole, who is the star, and I noticed that in Aceh she's also a UN Goodwill Ambassador. Now, to get things moving in Aceh or anyway, you also need a star to go up there. Is there a problem in that you talk about the politics of the skin, in that to get the compassion factor moving in the UN, you have to use stars to get people's consciousness raising after an event has gone through?
Well, tell me exactly what the question. I agree with everything you're saying. I just don't know what the question is exactly.
Yeah, because we're at wrap up now time, so I have to be very quick. What I'm saying is that in order now to get things moving in the UN, after you've had a crisis like you've had in Africa, and you showed that in the film, or in Rwanda, and after the tsunami as you have in Aceh, in order that things go off the barometer, things go off the radar, unless, like Nicole's going up into Aceh in a few weeks with television crews to get people concerned again about what's happening in the disaster area. Is there a danger now that to get people's compassion moving, you need the star?
Well, I don't think it's a danger. I think we have to use shortcuts in situations like this. And sometimes a shortcut is somebody that is a magnet for attention. And as long as we don't exploit people, as long as you're not, to be honest with you, the word I would say is cheesy. As long as you don't get cheesy with it, as long as you don't have hypocritical use of people who live lives which are antithetical to the causes that you're trying to raise consciousness for, and you're just doing it to be crass. As long as you don't do that, I don't see anything wrong with getting done what you have to get done. It seems to me more important to raise the consciousness and get the aid going than to worry that in order to do it, we're using a movie star, let's say, who's lived a life of luxury or who doesn't experience any of the pain firsthand. So I understand your question very well, but I still think finally in this case the results are the thing you have to get because it's an emergency situation.
I'm going to wind it up there. Sydney Pollack, thanks for having this premature, and from your point of view, conference with us a day early from the point of view of Berlin, but from the Valhalla Cinema in Sydney. A big round of applause.
Well,
and thanks for the movie.
Thank you all very much. It's good to visit with you. I wish I were there in person, and I sure appreciate your staying and your interest in the film and all your comments. Thanks so much.
Okay, good night.